Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 8th webinar in our series of Life After Furlough events by Wilkin Chapman Solicitors. I'm Teresa Thomas, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Elizabeth Blanchard and Patrick Scargill from Sowerby Accountants. The last few weeks feel rather like a repeat of the end of March, early April, when the furlough scheme came in, and we were getting weekly, sometimes daily updates and changes to the furlough scheme coming through. We were trying to keep you up to date, and everybody was being run a bit ragged, weren't they? So, as you know, the job support scheme was announced back on the 24th of September, seems such a long time ago now. And the whole point about it was to support and safeguard viable jobs due to the impact of COVID-19. To be honest, it didn't seem particularly attractive to employers when it was announced. Most of my employer clients weren't that keen on looking at having to pay a third of unworked hours. But as I'm sure you're all aware, last week all changed with the announcement on Thursday of the job support scheme open and closed with differing criteria and enhanced levels of government support. So we await, unfortunately, the detailed guidance. So whilst we're going to do our best today, and before I came upstairs to do this webinar, I did check the government website to see if they had actually announced anything today. We are told the detailed guidance and the Treasury directive is going to come out by the end of October. Well, here we are, lunchtime on the 29th. So we've got 2.5 days to go and counting. You know, it is regrettable that so many employers may have made plans on the original job support scheme and notifications to employees on that first version in the knowledge that the government were unlikely to change it at the last minute. Ha ha. We're going to do our best today to cover things that we definitely know about and some areas where there are grey areas where, of course, as any of you that have listened to my webinars and our webinars before will know that we like giving our view about what we expect it's going to be when it comes out. We'll take questions at the end after my part of the session. So please, at that time, raise your hand if you'd like us to pan to you live and for you to ask us a question live. Or if you don't want to be starring on the screen, type your questions using the Q&A icon on your screen, and I'll select those, read them out, and between Elizabeth, Patrick and myself, we will do our best to answer them. So to keep you awake from the off, I'm going to launch our first poll of the webinar. I'd be grateful if you could vote. So on the basis of what you know so far, is your business likely to use the job support scheme? Hopefully something's going to come up on your screen now. Yes, so are you likely to use a job support scheme? Yes, no, or a maybe. So we'll just have a few seconds to vote, and then we will see the answers to that. Interesting. So far, yes, so around 45% of you are going to definitely use a scheme, 15% probably not, and 40% maybe. So there's still a lot out there who indeed may be in a position where they haven't made their mind up yet, even though it's starting so soon. So to guide us through the maze of what we know thus far, I'm going to pass you over to Patrick, and over to you.
Afternoon, everybody. My name is Patrick Scargill from Sowerby Chartered Accountants in Beverley. I'm joined here, fellow partner from Sowerby's, Elizabeth Blanchard.
Hi, everyone.
So thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk about the new job support scheme, run through some of the main features of how it works, and more importantly, whether or not you or your business can benefit from the assistance available. So
the plan is we're going to structure it as a slight question and answer between Patrick and myself. Patrick will take the place of an employer, asking what we think are going to be the most relevant questions. But as Teresa says, don't worry if they don't come up, because towards the end there'll be plenty of time for you to ask any further questions.
Right, and Elizabeth has drawn the short straw today. She's going to have to pretend to be the expert accountant, and I'll be asking the questions as the concerned employer who's pulling his hair out trying to work out what I can pay my staff. Right, so the first question is probably the most obvious question. So furlough ends on the 31st of October. Is there another furlough scheme? Elizabeth?
Yes, a nice easy one to start with. As Teresa has mentioned, there are going to be some new schemes available. So from the 1st of November, just to clarify so we're all in the right position, we've got the job support scheme open and the job support scheme closed. One thing to say right from the outset, which we'll get to a little bit later as well, is job support scheme closed is for businesses legally required to close due to local or national restrictions at the moment.
So what are the main differences between the open support scheme and the old furlough scheme?
So the biggest difference we have is the furlough scheme allowed people to be flexibly working or not working. When we look at the job support scheme, there is a minimum requirement for employees to be at work. As Teresa mentioned, when this first came out, we were looking at employees being at work for at least a third of their normal hours. Luckily, this has now dropped down to 20% of their normal hours, but they must actually work this time, which is a big difference from the old furlough scheme. Employers pay the hours that the employee is working as normal, under their normal rates of pay. For the hours not worked, the employee receives 2/3 of what they would normally receive if they were working those hours. The employer contributes 5% of that, the government pays the rest. The government therefore pay what works out to be about 61.67% of that pay for those non-worked hours, but there is a cap on those, which currently is £1,541.75 a month. Unlike furlough, there is nothing for employers' national insurance or pension contributions, and these must be picked up by the employer.
Is the scheme open to all businesses? Is there any differentiation between business types?
Yes, open to all small and medium businesses, plus some larger businesses where their turnover has been directly affected by COVID, obviously in a negative direction, not a positive direction. We also think that there's going to be some restrictions for larger businesses. This will be stuff like capital distributions, dividends, etc.
And large businesses, I mean 250 employees and over.
Yes, looking like at the moment, when we're saying small and medium businesses, you've got your general criteria plus lower than 250 employees.
So next one, what if I've never used the furlough scheme before, or I've used the furlough scheme but for different employees?
So a positive of the job support scheme does not matter if the employee has not been on furlough previously, or if you as an employer never used furlough scheme 1 or furlough scheme 2. You can still use the job support scheme coming in on the 1st of November. However, for an employee to be relevant for this scheme, they must have been in your PAYE payroll system for on or before the 23rd of September. Now, what this means is we have submitted one of those RTIs, so the real-time information, to HMRC with that exact employee on or before the 23rd of September. If you haven't, unfortunately, they're not eligible for the scheme. However, there's a little kind of sidestep on some bits. If you had an employee that worked for you before 23rd of September, then left and has now come back, it does look like they are going to be eligible for the scheme.
Just going away from the script, if there's been an employee who started on the 1st of September and they're paid monthly, there is a potential gap there.
Yes, there is. As we saw with the original furlough schemes, the rules on this are quite strict. If an employee hasn't been on a RTI submission before the 23rd of September, it doesn't actually matter when they started.
Next question, how will I record the amount of time a person is working and how will their usual hours be worked out?
And here's the key question. You'll notice when you get to the appendices in these slides, I don't have them on the screen now. They will be slightly and briefly at the end, but you'll obviously get these slides after the talk as well. There are some examples which are current HMRC examples on how to work all this detail out. I don't suggest we go through these in detail now because there'll be variables for each business, and generally they are just huge calculations. There is a bit to do. But I'll go through some of the summarised bits now so we can understand vaguely where we are. The easy bit is the actual hours. When you're looking at your actual hours, you need to be, and these are the hours that people are working for you still, you need to be keeping a real clear track of these, both for the employee, so they know if they ever come back and ask you, both so you know they're hitting that 20% boundary, and in case HMRC come back and want to have a look at these. Other than that, you've got the time when the employee is not working. When you're looking at that time, you've got two key elements. You've got what we're calling a reference salary and usual hours. The reference salary is in essence the normal salary, and it's not dissimilar to how we worked out normal salary and usual hours during furlough. You work out your normal salary, adding and deducting certain bits, discretionary, non-discretionary elements. And then you apply this to the usual hours to see what usually the employee would get if they were working in those non-working hours. Apply the percentages and you go from there.
Okay. So does an employee have to just work the required hours, or can they work more?
So the 20% is the minimum requirement. If you have more hours for that employee available, great. They can definitely work more than that. Obviously, then that subsidy they get for not working changes in relation to that. You may just need to be careful when you're looking at all your employees, because you probably don't want one working 40% and one working 10%. There might be some balancing to do.
So just a bit of pre-planning required there if you've got the capability.
Yes, and that's something we can look at now. As Teresa says, it is down to the wire on this because we haven't had full legislation and it's almost the end of October, but there are certain things we can begin thinking about now, yes.
So next question, can I put an employee on the JSS scheme if they aren't able to work the required proportion of their hours? For example, if I've got to close through lack of trade.
So this is the tricky bit. Unless your business has been ordered to close, local or national restrictions legally required to close, then unless your employee can work that 20% and actually be at work for that, then they're not eligible for the scheme. This is unfortunate, but there's something to just be aware of there. If you do have employees that are off training, we for instance have a lot of staff members that go off to college. They get paid their normal work, but for a week they might be off at college. These hours all count towards that 20%.
And as well as that, do the actual hours have to be the same each week or month, and can they join and leave the scheme?
So as long as when they're within the scheme, the employee's working that 20%, they can cycle on and off the scheme. So you don't have to keep the same employee on the scheme at all times. They don't also have to be working the same pattern each month. They could do a different 20% based on different days. But it looks like there's going to be one rule within that any short-term working arrangement you come up with the employee must have a minimum period of 7 days before you switch that around.
And does that 7 days, so against monthly pay, against weekly, you still work on 7 days, regardless of whether it's monthly or weekly? Yeah.
The temporary working agreement, however you structure that, has to have a minimum of 7 days.
So next question. Under the job support scheme, can employers top up to 100%, as they did with the job retention scheme?
Strangely, originally, when we first got this new legislation, it didn't look like this was going to be possible. But maybe about 5 days ago, just as we're preparing this, we had a bit of a change. And it now looks like, whilst the employer must pay up to 5% of that reference salary where they're not working, Up to a maximum of £125 per month, there is a discretion for them to pay more than that if they wish. So looks like employer can top up under the level of minimum contributions. What impact this has, and if it does change anything else, we're not 100% sure of until the final legislation comes out.
Need more guidance at this point.
Yes.
Right. Can I put an employee on the JSS scheme if they're self-isolating, say if they've had a positive test or awaiting a test?
This is, again, quite an unfortunate one. Those employees that are self-isolating, unless they can complete their work at home, they classify as being off on sick. So therefore, they are not completing 20% of their actual working hours, and they cannot be on the scheme. There is something available, because as we all know, if you have to self-isolate, that's law, you must do that. So for those on low incomes, if they can't work from home and they've seen a drop in income, it looks like there's a supported payment of £500. But in general, the job supports, that isn't through the job support scheme, because in general, the job support scheme doesn't appear to be designed to support employees who are unable to work due to health concerns or who are currently shielding.
Difficult. Can I ask an employee to use holidays to make up the required proportion of worked hours to fulfil the JSS rules?
I'm expecting a bit more to appear about this, because at the moment it's not a specific point in the legislation, but generally holidays count as working. They are some of your working hours. So that would suggest that if you are off on holiday, those holiday hours build up into that required 20% of working. Just be careful though, if you're wanting employees to take holidays to make sure they reach that 20%, the normal employment rules of asking employees to take holidays in a short-term basis do apply.
I'd need to ask my handy solicitor on that front if I've got any contractual problems on holidays.
Yes, most definitely.
Yep, and as I say, right, no problems. So how does an employee get paid and how do I submit my claim?
Not a lot of difference here from the normal furlough rules we are used to. The employer pays the employee as normal. They must do that. You can't wait for the claim to come in until you pay the employee. The employee must get paid their full amount, the amount for the actual hours worked, and this grant amount when on their normal pay dates. Payments to businesses then get made in arrears after you've submitted your claim online. It looks like this claim window is going to open from the 8th of December. Probably very similar in setup to the furlough claiming service. Again, waiting for a bit more information on that, unfortunately. But we do know that claims will always be made in arrears. They won't overlap, and it's likely you'll be submitting monthly claims. If you've got an agent authorised to do your PAYE stuff, they can submit the claims for you, just like they could with the furlough claims.
Right, and if I recall, on the furlough claim, the money was actually paid out quite quickly once the claim was made. Was it within 7 days?
It was with the furlough scheme. They haven't suggested anything about that yet, but we'd like to hope it will be the same amount of time.
Biggie here. Would the government be making any checks on my submissions?
Yes, is the answer. It's something that the government HMRC as well are very keen on at the moment. Submissions will be audited. It looks like employees will either be contacted directly or information will be available publicly, so they know whether you are claiming for them under this scheme. To be eligible for the grant, employees must also have had a written agreement with their employers. So this is something that you need to keep a record of, that you've agreed to temporary short-term working arrangements with your employees. So HMRC can see this if they request a copy.
Right. And I would imagine normal rules apply. You've got to keep all your records for the 6 years after you've made the claims.
Yeah, anything at this point. We don't know what they'll be asking for if they do ask you, but keep all your records. Just make sure you've got everything there if required.
Next question. So if I do the JSS grant, will I still qualify for the furlough bonus that we're supposed to be getting in January?
Yes, so what happens here, employers using the JSS scheme, that doesn't change anything itself for the job retention bonus. If that employee was still eligible under all the normal rules for the job retention bonus that comes round, it doesn't matter that you've used the job support scheme. You can actually use the job support scheme payments to top up those employees' wages and make sure they meet the minimum income threshold for the retention bonus.
Thank you. And so, what if my business can't be open at all due to the tier that the location that I operate my business from? So, if national sort of restrictions say I am closed, what happens basically at that point? What happens if I can't operate?
This is where, from a job support scheme perspective, we enter job support scheme closed. This is what I mentioned right at the beginning. This is not if you close for a lack of trade, anything like that. This is if you are in a local or national restriction where legally you are not allowed to open. In that case, there is a job support scheme for you, and the wages of staff you will get some support to pay those. So up to 67%, maximum of 2083.33 a month from the government. Now, when you're looking at being closed legally, it does suggest that this is going to include premises that are restricted to delivery, collection only services from the premises, and they wouldn't be normally, and those restricted to provision of food or drink outside. Again, this is only a support, only a grant towards gross wages. The employer is still going to have to pick up the employer's national insurance, the pension contributions, and it also looks like the employer will be able to contribute more to the employee's pay if they want to. Just a little bit to be careful on though, the employees must be off work for a minimum of 7 consecutive days.
That's only if I've been ordered to close by the government.
Yes, it is.
Right. Okay. So obviously there's a closed and an open support scheme. You described them both. Can I claim both at the same time?
You can, if obviously you are eligible for both of them. You can be claiming the job support scheme open. You can be claiming the job support scheme closed. What you can't be doing is claiming both schemes for the same employee. The employee is under one scheme or the other.
So that's say if I have branches in tier 3 which are closed and a branch in tier 1 or 2. And so my employees are split over different geographical areas.
Yes, completely. Or you may have some employees you've been legally required to close, but some may still be able to work from home or do something for you, and still some may not be able to work at all. Getting towards the end of my list, but so does the employer get more support on the JSS scheme if the tier they're based in moves up a level? So no, when you're looking at the job support scheme on the open, it doesn't matter what tier you're in. There might be some other grants. In fact, I think you're going to ask me a question about that in a second, but generally for the job support scheme, no, the percentages are the same.
Okay. So preempting the next question, yeah. So are there any new grants available?
Yes, there are. So we're moving away now from the job support scheme. What we're looking at now are grants to the businesses. So if you are in a high alert area which is the tier 2s at the moment, it looks like there's going to be some grant funding available, which is going to come through the local authorities. It's going to be primarily for businesses in hospitality, accommodations, and the leisure sector. There may be some discretionary payments for other areas. We just don't know how it's going to be filtered through yet. You need to be adversely affected by these restrictions, obviously, and it looks like it could be up to $2,100 a month. We don't quite know how this is going to be spread out, but there's some presumed guidance on the slides at the moment, which looks like it's going to be on rateable value. If you are in a very high alert area, so these are the tier 3 elements, this grant's going to be a bit higher. Whether you're open or closed, it does look like you can get up to £3,000 per month, depending on what business you are. Obviously, generally, most likely in those sectors we've already mentioned. And finally, as I just flicked forward a bit too early, if you then look at this screen, you've got what I've termed the legally required to close grant. So this is not just to do with what tier you're in. This is you saying you have been required to close by a local national kind of lockdown element, and it looks like you could receive up to £3,000 per month. And there are certain restrictions on there, looking at certain rateable values of how these things work, which are all on the screens. What I'll do just before we hand over is I'll just quickly flick through the next screens just to show you where the appendices are. So on the next few slides, which will be available after this, you've just got the appendix, and it runs through in all this lovely detail how to calculate what looks like is going to be the job support elements that are available to you. There we go.
Okay, I think that's more or less wraps up our little Q&A session, and we'll have to see if the participants have got any questions come in. Back to you, Teresa.
Thank you. So I'm going to pick up a few sort of other legal aspects of the job support scheme and how it might affect you practically as an employer, and then touch on what are the alternatives available to you if you do not want to use the job support scheme. What can you actually do with your employees? So some particularly important things to note at this stage, whilst we're still waiting for the full guidance to come out, is that the job support scheme does not apply. You cannot claim it where employees are made redundant or given notice of redundancy. So that is very different from the furlough scheme. What you will recall with the furlough scheme is a lot of employers were claiming furlough, full furlough for their employees whilst they were effectively not working their notice period. It's cost the government a lot of money to pay furlough for those notice periods. So no surprise they've changed that with the job support scheme. What we do need clarification on, though, is whether an employer can start the redundancy consultation during a period which is being claimed for under the job support scheme. My view, and it is only my view, is that yes, whilst employees are at risk of redundancy and undertaking redundancy consultation, my view is you can claim under the job support scheme for that period of time, up to the point that a particular employee is put on notice, and then the obligation is going to come back to you as the employer to pick up that notice period. Now, what is also unclear, because they've talked about not being under notice of redundancy, is what if your employee is working notice for any other reason? What about if they resign, or they're under notice because of the termination of a fixed term contract? Again, we're awaiting the further guidance, but my view is because they've specifically said at this stage not redundancy, I think you're going to be able to claim under the job support scheme for those. Another area which looks like it might be different from furlough, but we're waiting clarification, is can your employee go and work for another employer in the unworked hours for the original employer? Obviously they could do that under the furlough and flexible furlough scheme. It's likely that they are going to be able to do that under the job support scheme, as long as they're obviously not in breach of their contractual obligations that they're owed to you. Oh, my computer is coming up with an error. Hang on, I think I need to turn some more power on. Bear with me. IT, hey. That's better. So, looking at the job support scheme and what alternatives we might have, as you're aware, and Patrick touched on it, and Elizabeth, as an employer, you know, before all of this coronavirus hit us. You can't just get an employee to reduce their pay and reduce their hours and give them less working hours unless you've got their agreement. So most employment contracts don't give you that possibility. You need to agree those changes. And as Elizabeth said, with the job support scheme, that needs to be in writing with your employee. So you need to be looking at a letter stroke agreement similar to the flexible furlough or full furlough arrangements. Obviously, we've got some precedents and examples of those if you want to take advantage of those. But faced with the alternatives, you know, at this time with the pandemic, is your employee likely to, you know, say that they do not want to go on the job support scheme? I don't think it's likely, because the alternatives are going to be layoff or redundancy or unpaid leave. So I think the majority of employees are likely to agree to go onto the job support scheme. But if you don't get their consent, you do face a potential unlawful deduction from wages claim or a breach of contract claim. So don't enter into these things lightly. Get advice if you're getting trouble from your employees and they don't want to go on the job support scheme and you want to utilise it. As with furlough, remember, you need to decide who to place on the job support scheme in a fair and completely non-discriminatory way by either drawing up a matrix of objective criteria similarly to redundancy scoring, or you might want to ask for volunteers in the first instance. If you're trying to spread those hours out, if you're trying to get everybody up to 20% so you can claim under the scheme, certainly asking for volunteers, seeing what people would be prepared to drop down to is a good practical way of looking at that. So the alternatives available to you as an employer. As we've touched on, the scheme is now far more attractive if you've got some hours available to meet that 20%. Or, as Elizabeth touched on, you can combine the working hours with some training hours, and provided you pay those training hours, to get to that minimum 20% threshold. You're still going to want to weigh up, aren't you, going on the job support scheme, the ability that you've got as an employer to pay a small proportion of the unworked hours, the 5%, against the potential costs of redundancies or other options, which if you've got a lot of employees that have got long service, the redundancy might be quite costly, and it's therefore cheaper to go onto the job support scheme. So if you don't want to use it, you could simply seek to agree reduced hours with your employees outside of the job support scheme. So then you haven't got to jump through any of the hoops about claiming. What you've got to do is you've got secure agreement with the employee to reduce their hours. So you're still going to need to have that discussion with them, put a proposal to them about reducing their working hours, consult with them, so have at least a couple of one-to-one meetings with them regarding your proposal to reduce their hours, and seek their agreement and try and secure their agreement in writing. So if you're one of those employees and your employer has decided, well, we're not going to use a job support scheme, let's just look at reducing working hours. Well, you might get a request from an employee, can I please go on the job support scheme? You remember we got this a lot with furlough, where employees were saying, well, I have a right to go on furlough. No, an employee never had a right to go on furlough, and an employee never has a right to go on the job support scheme. You have to agree to put them on the job support scheme. There are obviously cost consequences for you if you do use the scheme. I mean, obviously, if any of those employees were previously on the furlough, as Elizabeth said, you've got the job retention bonus as an additional incentive to keep those employees with you up until the payment of the job retention bonus in January. So unpaid leave, how attractive is that? Sounds ghastly, doesn't it, if you're an employee? But if you haven't, as the employer, got enough for the 20% minimum threshold, you might be in a position where you're not legally required to close, and therefore you can't go under the close scheme. We do have a situation where we've got a number of employers where you've got employees, they can't work from home. They're still not happy to return to the workplace, despite you telling the employee, showing them, doing risk assessments that you're COVID secure. Speak to your employees about whether they want to go on unpaid leave. They might be prepared to agree to this in order to have a job to return to when the situation improves. So again, you'll need to secure agreement in writing. But a year ago, I can't believe I would never have been having a conversation with you or advising you to speak to your employees about unpaid leave. But it is a viable option at this time. If you do consider jobs might be viable in the long term, but you haven't got any hours to give or very minimal hours in the short term, then another option available is layoff. Now, it's important here that it's only if you've got an express right, a contractual right in your contract of employment with your employees, enabling you to put your employees onto layoff. So if you have, and sometimes it's in there and you don't, employers don't realise until they have a look, but what it does mean is you can provide the employees with no work and no pay for a period whilst retaining them as an employee. And they've already agreed to it because they've signed their contract with a layoff or short-term time working clause within it. Now, what they are entitled to be paid is a statutory guarantee payment, but that's actually only for 5 days in a rolling 3-month period, and it's only £30 a day. So the great sum total of £150 you would need to pay them to put them onto layoff. But there are pretty complex rules around when and how an employee who is laid off for 4 consecutive weeks or 6 weeks in a rolling 13-week period, they can resign and claim redundancy from you. So if layoff's a possible option for you, then please seek our detailed guidance and advice before you decide whether you're going to use that layoff option. Now, your final alternative is obviously redundancies. So you can't afford to use the job support scheme. Other options, you've exhausted them, you don't think they're possible, then you might need to commence redundancy consultation. One thing to point out, this is going to go on for 6 months. Yes, there's going to be a review of the job support scheme in January. But as with furlough, you need to be aware if you're starting redundancy consultation that employees may argue it's unfair to make them redundant rather than place them on the job support scheme. How are you going to cover yourself if that's the situation? So if the job has genuinely ceased to exist, it's not likely to come back in the foreseeable future, then redundancy can be justified. But what I would suggest you do is document your reasons as to why you consider the job support scheme is not suitable in these particular circumstances, and show that you have considered the job support scheme as an alternative for each type of role. So you're going to need to do some bullet points at the time that you keep as to why you are putting that role at risk of redundancy, considering it for redundancy rather than the job support scheme. That way, you should be protected if the employee should latterly try and bring a claim for unfair dismissal in respect of being made redundant. Now, in relation to what you pay them if they are made redundant, we're expecting some similar regulations to come into place as for furlough, that an employee's week's pay for redundancy and their notice entitlement is based on their pre-furlough and their pre-job support scheme pay, so their usual pay. We're expecting that to come in. So that's the end of my short summary on what are your alternatives and where are there some loopholes potentially in the job support scheme. So if anyone's got any questions, as I say, please raise your hand if you want us to come to you live. Other than that, I can see that we've got some questions that have come in already. So I'll go to those first and then we'll look to someone who's put their hand up. Someone has asked, So one for you, Elizabeth. Is the job support scheme available to directors of limited companies who take a salary?
It does look like it is. Yes, at the moment, we're looking like it's under the same rules as furlough. It's all about those RTI submissions. Have you had an RTI submission go in on or before the 23rd of September with that salary on it?
Okay.
And obviously, being a director, you just need to be careful of your actual hours, same as we had before. Are you really not able to work those hours? You just need to be careful there.
We've got two questions here on holidays that I will pick up. So Liz Knox has asked, can you use holiday to make up the 20%? I think, Liz, you covered that in yours to say my understanding is we think so, but we're awaiting the additional guidance. Is that right?
Yes, it looks like at the moment it would be sensible that you could. Whether there'll be something that changes that in this final guidance at the end of October, I'm not sure, but presumably at this point, yes.
And we've got, does holiday pay accrue on unworked hours? Probably more of a legal question for me. Yes, same as furlough, your holiday is going to continue to accrue, so I don't see any difference with the job support scheme and furlough there.
There's another question, isn't there, about dividends?
Yeah.
Question about dividends. What can they be paid out when they claim in JSS? Yeah, whether there is guidance on large businesses not being able to pay dividends, but at the moment there's nothing available for small businesses. There was nothing there for the furlough scheme, so I would, at this point, the guidance doesn't say you can't pay dividends, but unless something comes out, we don't know, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't think from what we've had so far, I would no expectation whatsoever that if you're an SME that you are going to have any additional rules, hoops to jump over like the larger employer has. So I can see with the hand up we have got Wendy Williams. So Wendy, ask away. I think, Wendy, you've been asked to unmute, so you probably need to click your unmute button.
You got me?
Yep.
We have.
Okay. Thank you. I've got two questions. The first one is the grants to businesses. You mentioned those adversely affected. Mm-hmm. Now, we're a business of 8 people. We're a training company. So obviously, during the lockdown, all our clients closed, so it was impossible to continue. But because we didn't fall into any of the hospitality sectors, etc., when I put in a thing, we were turned down. Now, obviously, we're affected quite badly. So is there any forms of appeal for these, for us, our little business?
Well, for an answer from our point of view, accounting, we haven't seen anything. Unfortunately, if you just fall between the cracks, there is, it's just very unfortunate. There's nothing available for you because you do fall between that. It's like example, somebody's just closing through lack of trade, lack of business. That is where you fall into, unfortunately. So at the moment, from a HMRC point of view, we can't see any appeals process.
Which makes it more likely we could end up closing. It's ridiculous, isn't it, when you're trying to keep people employed?
Absolutely. Very unfortunate, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it is. My second question, probably Teresa, you'll answer this one. We've got 4 office staff and a couple of trainers, so contracts different hours. One of our ladies only works 11 hours a week, 5.5 hours a day. So if I was to do the 20%, it's basically not worth coming in. So under the furlough, we kept her furloughed as the other employees agreed that they would do more hours. And I was worried that was being discriminatory, even though people agreed. So if I do the same thing now, will I need to get that into writing?
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to be able to claim for her under the job support scheme if you're not getting her to do any work, Wendy. So, you know, if it was fine with full furlough, because obviously.
Yeah, sorry. What I meant was I want her to do her whole 11 hours. So she's doing 100% of her work, but the others this time will do less.
Yes, that's absolutely fine in terms of her job role. So yes, if you've got a need for her job role, she can work her full hours, and then you'll need to consult with the others about reducing theirs. Now, they might say, well, that's pretty unfair because, you know, we took her hours when she was on furlough. Can't you level it out amongst us? Which is a point for you to consider as part of your consultation with those staff. So it does depend on, obviously, you said the office skills, presumably they've all, you know, they've all got different functions within the office environment.
No, they all do the same work. They all do the same work.
So why wouldn't you want to share it out equally amongst them so they all feel like they're getting a fair crack of the cake and, you know, losing the same pretty similar amounts of money?
Well, I think because she just does 2 days 11, if I get her to do her 2 days and give the others 2 days rather than 4 days, to me that is, and they're working 8 hours opposed to her 5.5, so they're not going to lose. It's just because she's doing 100%, but they'll only be doing, you know, whatever, 50%.
Well, yes, so they are losing out to a greater percentage than she is, which they might not be happy with, Wendy. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to use the holiday entitlement, so they will get their pay.
Right. Okay. So yes, you know, all I can say really, my advice to you is start consulting with them. You're not being discriminatory for any protected risk that we need to worry about under the Equality Act. As long as you're not, you know, selecting them because of a disability or their sex or race.
Oh, brilliant.
Fine. Just talk to them, have an open conversation and see what you can agree with each of them.
Oh, that's really good. Thank you for that.
That's okay. Thank you, Wendy. And we've got Anthony Noonan with his hand up. So we'll come to you, Anthony, for you to ask your question, if that's okay.
Hiya. Yep, just unmuting. I've got 3 questions, please.
3 on this occasion. Okay.
I've got 3. Let's get our money's worth. The first question is, we're talking about setting up new arrangements in chunks of 7 days. So does that 7 days include weekends? So I'll be talking about a working week. The second part of the question is, we're talking about a minimum, or people having to be able to work for a minimum of 20%, 1 day a week, in order to qualify. At the moment, I probably have at least one individual who, because of the nature of the restrictions at the moment, is almost unable to work, period. But I would want to keep them on until the world becomes a better place. So what is the definition of work? Can I just pay them 20%, period, and then claim the rest? And my last question is, we're talking about hours. Are we able to define working periods in terms of days rather than hours? So people work for 1 day a week, that would be 20%, 2 days, 40%, etc., without reference to the number of hours which they work within that day.
Right, okay, 3 questions.
3 questions.
First one, 7 days. Yeah, basically a working week, 7 days. Yes, it doesn't matter if the normal working week's 5 days. Everything's calculated on 7 days.
Okay.
There's a bit of a weird one with if you're monthly, and because the job retention job JSS scheme starts on the 2nd of November. It's you have to calculate everything on sort of 29 out of 30 days, which is a bit strange. But yes, it just works on 7 days. on that
Yep.
front, so it's a proportion of 7 days. The 20%, funnily enough, this was one we asked between ourselves before we came on. Can you just pay somebody 20% and say, as far as we're aware, no, they have to be working or on holiday, because holiday counts as being at work. So no, they physically have to do 20% of their normal time. I think that's right, Teresa?
It is, yes, absolutely.
And the last one, that was, sorry, I didn't write that one down.
I think that one was on the hours. As far as we are aware, it will be based on hours because that's how the calculation for the non-working time is done on usual hours, because of the variable hours that a lot of workers do. It's just how HMRC have decided to calculate it. It will be an hours-based calculation.
Right.
Anthony, I don't know whether you use the flexible furlough scheme at all, which started the whole complex of calculation of hours worked, not worked, etc. You know, unfortunately, although I think they're trying to simplify it a little, they've not really achieved it thus far. You know, it is going to be as mind-numbingly boring doing it for this, and it is all about hours, I'm afraid. So yeah, definitely over to the accountants for that one if you've got any queries with your calculation. Call Elizabeth or Patrick. Definitely not me or my team on working that out. Yes, they're obsessed with hours.
So if I go back to the question about definition of work, I'm thinking of one individual in particular. If I gave them a project to think how, I don't know, we might reconcile the Russians and the Chinese, and they submit a one-page report at the end of the month, is that reasonable?
Look, put it this way, Anthony, it's up to your discretion what work you give them to do in that 20%. You need to be giving them some work to be undertaken. So I don't think I need to say any more, do I? Other than they ought to be doing some work is what we're going to tell you are the rules.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks for coming on. I think in the chat, we've got some more in the Q&A, but we've got one in the chat that came up that is relevant for you, Elizabeth or Patrick, about the grant. Richard has asked, will I still get a grant if, I think he's saying, if I'm forced to close, but don't pay rates, i.e. I pay an all-inclusive rental charge? Definitely one for you guys.
Yeah, I think that comes from the slides that I had up. I think it's an important point to note, actually. Those slides are what we're thinking as an approximate guide as to how this grant funding will come through the local authorities. It's all up to local authority discretion to determine which businesses are eligible for grant funding. So whilst there isn't an actual answer to Richard's question there specifically at this point, that doesn't mean to say it's necessarily going to be handed out as the slides were. That's just what HMRC have said at the moment is a general guide.
Okay, going to the Q&A. First question on there at the moment is there a minimum that an employee should earn? Does the company have to top up to a minimum overall percentage? They're talking about the cap. But the reality is it's all about percentages, isn't it? It's not about pounds and pence. The cap is the most that the government needs to pay, and you as an employer pay the percentage of. The company doesn't, for unworked hours, it doesn't need to pay any more than the 5% of the unworked hours subject to that cap, which Elizabeth mentioned earlier, which was £125, I think, isn't it? The cap for the employer. It's up to you if you want to answer, but if you want to pay more than that, but no, you don't have to.
Yeah, we're in the unfortunate situation where the reduction as a percentage for higher earners is quite punitive. So, and there's nothing else you can do about that.
Celia's asked, can someone on JSS work 100% 1 week and 20% another? Yes. Yeah, as we talked about that week, 1 week they can work 20, 150, 100, as long as it's in weeks are the rules. One for you, Elizabeth. My employees are on a 0 hours contract and their hours and working patterns change week to week depending on the needs of the business. Where do I stand on the scheme?
So when we're thinking of the scheme and not anything else that you might do with people on 0 hours contracts, which I might pass back to you for, Teresa, when you're looking at the scheme, this is where all those usual hours things comes in. You work out those usual average hours over the period of time as directed by those appendices in the slides. And then they must work 20% within the pay pattern of their average hours.
Absolutely. So on those slides, which I'll share with you all on email tomorrow, Elizabeth has kindly set out, if somebody does variable hours and has variable pay, which is your 0 hours per people, what the calculation dates are between the periods and what you should be using by way of usual hours and usual pay. But yes, you'd get bored senseless if we read those all out now. As to from an employment point of view, if you want to use a scheme, then that's great. Utilize the scheme if you want to keep them on your books. It may be that having them on 0 hours, it gives you more flexibility in terms of your other options that I talked about earlier regarding not using the scheme and utilising other aspects. So if you want to consider not putting them on the job support scheme, do get in touch with me and we can discuss what is potentially available to you as alternatives.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and of course you can cycle on and off the scheme. That's where you fall back into that section.
Yeah, I was going to mention one question we haven't answered is just a reminder that all these grants that are coming in, as with the furlough, are taxable. So you will pay tax on as an income.
Absolutely. One last question, I think. I'm going to put this to you, Elizabeth. It's all about calculations. So it says the calculations for variable hours includes a bit looking at the higher of 3 variables. One of the variables is what they have earned in the past few months. So does that include their furlough pay?
Previously, this is an interesting question. I'm waiting for a bit more detail on this, if I'm honest, because previously when we were looking at our furlough calculations, it was everything excluding furlough pay to give us that average normal wage. With that new conferred variable that's come out, it's likely a lot of people in that element of time could have been on furlough. So it may be that that period does include their furlough pay. We are waiting, as I said, for more detail on that. So unfortunately, I can't answer it 100%, but I would suggest if we run the calculations anyway, the way furlough worked is probably that variable falls out anyway, because it won't be the highest average. The highest average will probably be the time within the last tax year or the same period for last year.
Yeah, I agree. It's really unlikely, isn't it, that when they're on furlough, it's going to be the higher of those two. Thanks everyone for joining us today. If anyone's got any other questions, by all means, email us. I will be sending, as I say, an email tomorrow with the slides, with a link to the webinar, just in case you want to listen to it all again or fast forward to certain parts. I'll be sharing that with you as well. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Elizabeth and Patrick, as well, for joining me today. Hope you've all found it useful, and no doubt when the guidance comes out in the next 2.5 days, we might be sending you a bit of an email circular around with any updates that might be useful from the questions that you've sent to us today, that we will then have hopefully the definitive answer to. So thanks everyone.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.